is a follow-up to one of the best first-person shooters ever conceived by man. Bioshock 2 is a game that had a tall mountain to live up to. It's a game that's been regarded as a step forward and a step back from the original Bioshock, but either way, it's still a phenomenal entry into the world of Rapture. That being said, Bioshock 2 is a bit of a gem. It's a game that made improvements over its predecessor, with things like the ability to use both weapons and plasmids at the same time, allowing the player to have a smoother experience during combat. Unfortunately, Bioshock 2 was a game that had to follow up a story that I personally feel was one of the best in gaming at the time. Either way, Bioshock 2 is still great and honestly is one of the most fun times to be had in a game, even to this day. So with that, let's get into Bioshock 2. Developed by 2K Marin and published by 2K Games, Bioshock 2 would release on PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Windows on February 9th, 2010, and also for Mac OS X on March 29th, 2012. The game would be received positively upon release with an 88 Metacritic across the board, though it would fall below the same 90 score range as its predecessor due to some feeling that the game was less memorable than Bioshock 1, and also that it followed the first game's formula without really adding all that much to it. The game would also be included, without its original multiplayer component, in the Bioshock collection. I mentioned the collection in my previous video, and that the overall collection score was lower than that of the initial entries of the series. Closing this all out, once again, Bioshock as a series is one that's shipped over 43 million units as a whole, which is something that makes it a top-selling video game franchise as well. Taking a small step back, yep, Bioshock 2's initial release had also included a multiplayer component titled The Fall of Rapture. Developed by Digital Extremes, the same people who developed Warframe, this extra portion of the game was essentially its own thing, with players battling throughout Rapture in a multiplayer mode that takes place during the Rapture Civil War. It's supposed to serve as a small prequel to show the events leading up to the first game, though it's done via PvP. I don't really want to spend too much time talking about this, but it's about what you'd expect. There's different game modes with their own names, all similar to stuff from Call of Duty like Free-for-All, Team Deathmatch, and Capture the Flag. The game also had a number of DLCs. Outside of the multiplayer stuff, one of which was the Protector Trials, which was Bioshock 2's version of the challenge rooms from the first game. You're essentially just protecting your little sister so that she could collect Adam. Each stage has a different loadout and whatnot. It's a way to unlock extra bits on the game, including artwork and promotional stuff. It's honestly whatever, not great, but just okay. Then there was also the Minerva's Den story DLC, something that was actually regarded very highly. This is something we'll get into a bit more later, but for now, I'll just say that the Minerva's Den DLC is quite good. One last thing I wanted to mention before moving on to the story. Bioshock 2 also had its own special limited edition that was available for 360, PS3, and Windows. This edition consisted of a bunch of bonus items, including an art book, posters, and audio recordings. Obviously, it also included the game too. Either way, just a little something interesting worth mentioning. So with all that out of the way, spoiler warning, because we're now ready to dive into the game itself. Let's go back to Rapture, shall we? Initially beginning prior to the events of the first Bioshock, while Rapture is still a bustling city without all the crazy to it, we find ourselves following along a little sister, while seeing in a reflection that we are a big daddy, who is referred to as Subject Delta within the game. During this scene, we witness the little sister harvest Adam from a body as the Delta tries to follow along, eventually hearing the scream of the girl. This is where we witness a bunch of splicers trying to get the little girl's Adam. Delta then comes into the rescue, dropping onto a dude by landing right on his head. This is followed by a battle with Delta bodying some dude with his drill and then tossing him aside like he's nothing. Delta eventually gets hit with a hypnotizing plasmid, and then we see our first sighting of Sophia Lamb, who comes out of nowhere. She tells Delta that the little sister is named Eleanor and that she isn't his. Lamb then gets Delta to kneel and put a pistol to his head, and yeah, pow. Screen goes black and then the Bioshock 2 logo appears. We now see a cut 10 years later with Delta being awoken by the static of a radio call of Tenenbaum. From here, Delta finds himself in the Adonis luxury resort side of Rapture with the area in disrepair. He heads on, making his way through the place, eventually seeing a vision of Eleanor before finding an electrobolt plasmid. Delta uses the plasmid, thus allowing him the power of electricity. Right after this, we see a little sister who tells Delta that he's been sleeping for a long long time and that we're to find Eleanor. This is followed by a big sister coming out of nowhere and snatching the little sister away. Delta follows behind, using the Electrobolt Plasmid to restore power to the pool room when we're contacted by Tenenbaum, who tells Delta to find her in the Atlantic Express train station. Continuing from here, Delta eventually comes across a room with the little sister who greets him before a big sister comes out of nowhere, attacking him. Delta fights off the big sister in a tough battle before it makes its retreat. Delta makes chase, eventually coming across a giant room where the big sister breaks the window of, causing it to flood. Surviving this endeavor thanks to his suit, Delta continues onward to the train station. He goes on to search for Tenenbaum when he's halted by Lamb, who recognizes him. She gets Splicers to go and attack him, but the floor collapses in the process, allowing Delta to make an escape to a maintenance runoff pumping station. Delta continues on, eventually making it to a room with a telekinesis plasmid where he's again contacted by Eleanor, who tells him to use the plasmid and to also find her. Delta goes on from here, with Lamb bothering him along the way by saying that he has no place in paradise. But anyways, Delta's contacted by Tenenbaum after this, who tells him that he's an old Big Daddy who is bonded to a single little sister. When he's apart from her for too long, his body apparently begins to shut down as well. And also that as long as the girl is in rapture, Delta's stuck there as well. At this moment, we officially find out that the name of Delta's little sister is Eleanor Lamb, daughter of Sophia, and that she's being held at Fontaine Futuristics all the way across Rapture. From here, we eventually run into the ticket booth where Tenenbaum is holed up. Tenenbaum tells us that she had come back to Rapture to rescue the little sisters, and that Sophia Lamb was using them for something that she was unsure of. This is followed by Sophia coming out on a loudspeaker and getting Splicers to come and attack, which leads Delta to have to fight off Splicers while Tenenbaum escapes off with the little sisters. After this, Delta is contacted by Tenenbaum again, who sends him off to Sinclair, who will apparently lead him to Eleanor. Right after this, Sinclair contacts Delta, introducing himself by saying that he has an interest in the Fontaine building and that the two should be able to work together. From here, Delta's then told to take a train to Ryan Amusements. While there, Delta stops the train before it could crash into a giant frozen wall. Delta's then tasked with finding an incinerate plasmid within the amusement park, but first he has to get a ticket to enter. He does so, being contacted by Sinclair again, who tells him that he needs Adam from a little sister in order to be able to purchase the plasmid. While heading back, Delta sees a Splicer trying to smash open a glass window to get a machine gun. Delta takes this opportunity to body the Splicer and then grab the machine gun for himself. He then heads into the park to search for a little sister. Delta takes out a Big Daddy, adopting its little sister, and then getting her to gather Adam for him. He gets enough Adam and then goes and purchases the incinerate plasmid. From here, Delta heads back to the station, but before he's able to do so, a big sister comes out of nowhere and attacks. Delta drops this thing in another tough fight and then goes back to the station to melt the ice and then restarts the train line. While doing so, Sinclair jumps onto the train and then a bunch of Splicers sent by Lamb come out of nowhere and attack. Delta slaughters the Splicers and then takes the train onwards where it stops and put on lockdown at Pauper's Drop. Sinclair then tells Delta that if he's to end the lockdown, he has to get a security override key from Grace Holloway, who's located at the Sinclair Deluxe. Upon heading there, a gigantic brute Splicer comes out of nowhere and destroys the entrance. This leads Delta to have to find a way to get through the rubble. He does so by finding a research camera and then learning how to use Drill Dash after filming a brute Splicer. Delta then heads back to Sinclair Deluxe and dashes through the collapsed entrance, allowing him to continue on to find Grace. Upon making his way through the building, wrecking Splicers along the way, Delta finally comes across Grace, who's in a room locked by a hidden switch. Grace tells Delta that he could have the key, going on to also explain some backstory that Eleanor had disappeared and one day showed up again alongside Delta. Grace also mentions that Delta had broken her jaw when she tried to go and hold Eleanor upon seeing her again. After this, Delta is led into the room where he takes the override key and spares Grace, continuing back to the train station and ending the lockdown after. From here, Delta rides the train out of Pauper's Drop, where he's sadly blasted out of it by a torpedo sent by Simon Wales. Surviving the event, Sinclair contacts Delta, telling him that he's in Dionysus Park, but the train car's wrecked and that the place is flooded and sealed. He's also told that in order to regroup with Sinclair, he'll need to head through Siren Alley to activate a pumping station in order to drain the park. Upon heading into Siren's Alley, Sinclair contacts Delta, telling him that Simon and his brother were the architects of Rapture, but were essentially brainwashed by Lamb. Delta is also told that Simon has a church at the pumping station, which is our destination at this point. Upon heading through the alley, Delta finds that the door to the station's locked, thus having him have to use a code to enter. But before Delta could continue, the doors stopped with the power being cut and Lamb coming on a loudspeaker, causing splicers to come and attack. This prompts Delta to have to fight while waiting for the backup power to kick in. After cleaning house, Delta continues to the pumping station, dropping whales in the process. Shortly after, Delta finds and throws a switch to clear out the water from Dionysus Park. This leads Lamb to overload the pumps to Siren Alley, causing the area to become completely flooded. After this, Delta makes his escape and thus finally makes it to Dionysus Park. Upon entering the area, Delta is told to get to the train station to find Sinclair, where it's learned that he's found a new train car. However, Sinclair also discovers that there's a lockdown and that they aren't alone in Dionysus Park. This is followed by a dude named Stanley Poole saying that he wants to cut a deal with the pair. This leads Delta to head into the station to find Poole, who's locked up in the booth. As Delta journeys further into the park, he's contacted by Lamb, who basically tells him that he's disgracing the area by walking there. This is followed by Stanley saying that he's essentially incognito, but since the park was drained, Little Sisters are now roaming the area, something that he doesn't want happening. Delta is told that the Little Sisters collecting Adam will essentially cause Stanley to be discovered by Lamb. Therefore, Delta's cut a deal that if he clears the Little Sisters out of the area, then Stanley will release the lockdown and allow him to continue onwards. This next part is essentially just saving or harvesting Little Sisters. Every time a Little Sister saved, we learn more and more about Stanley's backstory and how he was the reason Eleanor was turned into a Little Sister in the first place. During this section, we also learn that Delta was actually a dude named Johnny Topside as well, someone who actually found Rapture on his own. Sadly, this also caused Ryan to be spooked by the whole thing, which led to Johnny Topside being turned into a Big Daddy. Anyways, once all of the Little Sisters gathering is done and over, Delta goes back to Stanley. While there, Sophia Lamb contacts Delta again, telling him that she knew of Stanley's betrayal. She goes on to say that Stanley was the one who gave Johnny Topside to Ryan in the first place as well. This leads to the player being given the option to either kill or spare Stanley. I chose to let Stanley live and just continued on to the next area personally. Anyways, Delta now heads into Fontaine Futuristics. From here, Sinclair once again contacts him, saying that Eleanor is deep within and that he needs to sneak in to find her. Upon entering the area, Delta finds a message created by Gil Alexander, who essentially says that by the time we see this, he's probably insane. Sinclair overhears this, saying that Gil Alexander was in charge of Big Daddy development and that he probably had something to do with Delta and Eleanor. From here, we find out that Alexander is in fact crazy. He basically hinders Delta from progressing by causing him to have to break some signal relays in order to enter the security office. Once he's finally able to enter the office, he finds a switch to flip to continue on to the lab area. From here, Delta discovers another message by Gil Alexander where he's told to flip some breakers to restore power to the area. After doing this, another message pops up. We also find out that Gil Alexander was to be the host for all the Atom, which would allow them to create the first Utopian. This is something that essentially turned the dude into a monster that Delta is then asked to kill. To do so, he's to lure out Gil from hiding by finding Atom-infused plants. While going through the area, Delta comes across the area where he was bound to Eleanor as well. Anyways, Delta finds all the plants and returns to Gil, also learning from Lamb that it was Gil's will to die the whole time. This inevitably leads to another moral choice, but first, Delta has to drop some dudes. After this, we can either just take the gene sample and leave, or take the gene sample and kill Gil. Again, for the sake of continuity, Gil was left alive. Delta heads to the oxyfill station and uses the gene sample key to enter Persephone. Let me just add, we're now closing in on the final stretch of Bioshock 2. Anyways, the goal now is to find Eleanor. While heading further in, Delta's contacted by her and is told that she's trapped. Not long after, Delta heads into the atrium area, finally closing in on his goal. But before he could actually get to Eleanor, oh no, he's attacked by not one, but two big sisters. Delta slaughters these things and then heads into the quarantine chamber where he discovers that Sophie is in the same room as Eleanor. At this point, Lamb says the only reason Delta was restored was because Eleanor wanted a father, so she restored him in body and mind. We then see a few shots of Delta being revived in a Vita chamber, as well as some of our actions throughout the game. After this, Sophia smothers Eleanor with a pillow in order to stop her heart long enough to cause Delta's bond with her to be severed. This is followed by Eleanor sending in a little sister to come and help him escape. During this section, we have to essentially take control of a little sister, collecting pieces of a big sister outfit to give to Eleanor. Once all this is done, Eleanor then saves the little sister and then goes and rescues Delta. After being freed, Delta is given a plasmid to summon Eleanor and then heads off back back to the atrium. At this point, it's discovered that Sophia is going to drop Persephone into a trench, which leads the two to have to find Sinclair so that they can escape. Upon journeying into inner Persephone, Delta comes across Sinclair's lifeboat. At this moment, Delta is also informed that charges have in fact been set to blow up and sink Persephone. With the whole place on lockdown, Delta then heads to reverse it in the holding wing. Upon venturing into the area, it's discovered that our buddy Sinclair has been turned into a big daddy and is being controlled by Lamb, who is now inside of Sinclair's lifeboat as well. Very sad. Anyways, Delta chases after Sinclair, who has the master key to the place. Delta also finds out that Sinclair had rented him out to some plasmid trials at Fontaine's, something that he feels like he's now paying for. This is followed by Sinclair telling Delta to put him out of his misery and take the lifeboat. Ultimately, Delta bodies Sinclair, taking the master key from his corpse. After this, Delta ends the lockdown on the area too, something that also releases all the prisoners as well. After the lockdown's ended, Delta heads to the lifeboats, eliminating everything along the way. When Delta returns to the docking area, however, an explosion occurs where we find out that Sophia had bombed out the ballast compressors of the lifeboat, something that would cause it to now be too heavy to launch. Eleanor then comes up with a solution to boil away the water to cause the lifeboat to rise, but in order to do this, they need to head to the pediatric wards and gain the help of little sisters. They do all this, and then Delta finds himself back at the docking platform, where Eleanor then begins boiling the water. At this point, a whole bunch of enemies come out in full force attack. Delta fights the waves off and then releases the docking mechanism and destroys some pipes to flood the room. Delta then heads to a nearby elevator with Eleanor, running through a hallway where, oh no, there are a bunch of bombs. At this moment, we see Eleanor teleport out, and what is most likely Delta getting blasted by the explosion. However, he is able to somehow manage to grab a hold of the lifeboat, where we see Sophia and Eleanor inside, with Sophia about to drown but is saved by Eleanor thanks to our choices. This is followed up by a close-up with Eleanor saying that she needs Delta to guide her. This prompts her to pierce Delta with the little sister needle, which essentially passes all of his memories and whatnot to her. We then see a shot of the lighthouse with Eleanor looking into the water, surrounded by little sisters. One of the little sisters gives Eleanor a toy Big Daddy, which she drops into the ocean, and then says that in their story, Rapture was just the beginning, and then the game ends. And that, my friends, is Bioshock 2. My overall thoughts of Bioshock 2 are probably a bit more mixed than the original. While I think that the game does a lot to improve the formula of the first Bioshock, like the combat for example, it does seem to lack in some areas, and some of the retconning is a little since there's no mention of Lamb in the first game. Though I will say that the idea of her leading a cult with the Rapture family is at least interesting. But there's a lot that occurs towards the end of the game that feels somewhat cobbled together and rushed. Some parts feel kind of lazy too. Like, for example, getting the big sister suit pieces. It's an interesting idea to see the game differently through the eyes of the little sister here, but really, it seems kind of recycled. We had to get Jack the Big Daddy outfit in Bioshock 1, and now we're doing something similar in 2? Okay, fine. And then really the whole section at the end of the game with just kind of like an onslaught of waves of enemies. Unremarkable. Sinclair being captured and then turned into a Big Daddy like in a short time frame felt kind of weird too. Kind of did him a little dirty here. And then no real final showdown with Lamb. The game just sort of ends with everything resolved based on whatever actions the player takes throughout the game. It's fine in some ways, but it feels sort of cheap in others. But what I find to be the worst is just how quick the game ends. It's like you're going and then bam, over. Still a good game, but damn does the last section feel like they didn't know a good way to actually resolve everything. Moving along, we'll just gloss over some quick stuff. Bioshock 2 is pretty much the same as the first game, with the sense that there is some open-endedness to player preference and gameplay style. There's some obvious changes as you're playing as a Big Daddy, so weapons are based more towards that. For example, you get a drill instead of the wrench. It pretty much works the same way, and a lot of the gene tonic buffs are nearly identical to the originals when it comes to the melee stuff. Basically, something like drill power acts as the same thing as Bioshock 1's wrench jockey. Gene tonics in general work a lot differently, since you now have the ability to equip a lot more buffs that might be specific towards combat versus how these worked in Bioshock 1, where you might have a section specific for combat and something specific for hacking related tonics. Either way, it helps out in the end, since it really helps you do far more damage, since you could just load up on things that help make stuff like the drill crazy overpowered. There's also additional changes to of the game that help separate itself from its predecessor as well. Beginning with the Little Sisters atom gathering, in addition to being able to straight up rescue or harvest, Bioshock 2 introduces a new way to gather atom. You can do this by defending sisters while they grab atom off of bodies while enemies relentlessly attack. I'm not entirely sure if I'm a fan of this one, but it is at least something different. Another major difference is that the hacking minigame in Bioshock 2 is drastically different from the original game. You no longer have to solve a little puzzle, it's just hitting green and blue marks with a needle while avoiding red marks. Hitting blue marks give a bonus, and green is pretty much just to complete the minigame. It's whatever. I think I prefer it over the first game's hacking, but it is what it is. Anyways, next we'll go over the weapons in Bioshock 2. Like I said before, you got the drill. This thing has the ability to do a spin attack and also the drill dash. It's worth mentioning that the drill also uses fuel in order to function as more than just a melee attack. In comparison to the wrench in Bioshock 1, I would say that the drill is way stronger too, mainly because of the spin attack, which is kind of overpowered once you have research maxed out, and some of the better plasmids and gene tonics. Other weapons include the rivet gun. Wasn't really a fan of this. It felt just as meh as the pistol from the first game. The machine gun, its comparison would be the submachine gun from the first game, though I feel that it's much stronger in Bioshock 2. The shotgun, it's okay. I don't think it's great since things like the incendiary rounds feel a little underwhelming, though at max upgrades it does feel like a solid choice over stuff like the rivet gun and the spear gun. Speaking of which, the spear gun felt pretty bad and was honestly my least favorite weapon due to how slow it shot and just how underwhelming the other ammo types were, especially if you compare it to the crossbow in Bioshock 1, which was overpowered. Beyond that, there was the launcher. This kind of works the same way as the one from the original game, but I honestly don't think I really used it all that much. Then there's the hacking tools. Not much to say here. They let you auto hack or manually hack from a distance, but there's also the mini turret that you can launch and use to help fight enemies. That's okay, just a little extra damage here. And once again, there's another camera, though this time you record footage instead of just taking pictures. You can get higher score by using a combination of plasmids and also attacking enemies. The same stuff applies from the first game. Use the camera and max out research to get buffs. You can also upgrade your weapons in Bioshock 2 as well. Pretty much everything here is like damage buffs and whatnot, with extra bonuses when you fully upgrade weapons. For example, the shotgun fully upgraded shoots electro rounds, making it a very good weapon by the end. But I'll just flat out say it, the drill is so good in this game that it's mainly what I found myself using, since the gene tonics make you unstoppable with this thing. Beyond the weapons, there's the plasmids. Again, in the same vein as Bioshock 1, you have a lot of stuff that's very similar. The main plasmids here worth mentioning are Winter Freeze, Electro Bolt, Incinerate, and an Insect Swarm. In the same way as the first game, Winter Freeze freezes enemies, Electro Bolt shocks and stuns enemies, and then there's the Incinerate, which can do stuff like melt ice and cause enemies to set on fire, causing them to take damage over time. Same goes for Insect Swarm. This thing will surround enemies and cause them to take damage over time and sort of stuns them too. If you're wondering what I found to be the best combination in the game, well, I personally liked Winter Freeze in combination with the drill. It felt super overpowered and honestly was able to shred through pretty much every enemy in the game using the spin attack and by spamming freeze. This might not be something for everyone, but it was what I found to be what worked best for me. As for the game's enemies, there's a lot of stuff similar to the first game and some new enemies as well. Beginning with the Thuggish Splicer, these are your basic enemies. They're essentially the melee variants of the Splicer. Pretty easy dudes, you can essentially just run up and smack them a few times to get them down. Then there's the Leadheads. These dudes got guns. They're a little more difficult, but not too bad. Then there's the Houdini Splicer. These are the same kinds of scumbags from the first game. They like teleporting around and can be quite annoying to fight. There's also the Spider Splicer. Same as the first game, they're fast enemies who like to climb on walls and throw stuff. Not the worst thing, but can get a few cheap shots here and there. Then there's the new Brute Splicer. This thing is basically a splicer on steroids. These dudes are super strong and really reminiscent of something like the Bouncer Big Daddy. They're easily the most difficult of the splicer fights, so it's best to be prepared for these guys. Outside of the splicers, we have the Big Daddies again. Same as the first game, we have the Bouncer and the Rosy Big Daddies. Bouncer Big Daddy's got the big old drill and the Rosy's got the gun. Dodging around and firing off ammo or using the drill spin is a good way to take out these things quickly. But outside of the original game's Big Daddies, we got ourselves a bunch of new stuff too. Beginning with the Rumbler, these things have a launcher on their shoulder. Their main attacks are basically a grenade launcher and these little mini turret things. Other than the Rumblers, we get the Alpha Series Big Daddies. These dudes are super aggressive and like to run up on you. I honestly didn't expect to get so brutalized by one of these things since they kind of come out of nowhere. I'd say that they'd be the hardest fights in the game if it wasn't for the last enemy, the Big Sister. These things are extremely quick and can be frustrating since they have a lot of health. Every encounter with them is epic, and when you can finally get them down, it's a satisfying feeling. Before moving on, we also got the security stuff in the game. There's the cameras, there's the turrets, there's the bots. Same as the first game, they could be hacked. Nothing really too special here. It's best to hack them so they could help you get rid of other enemies in the game. That's really it. Atmospherically, Bioshock 2 is just as brilliant as the first game. Rapture as a setting is still wonderful with the usage of Art Deco architecture, and each and every area in the game feels like it was methodically designed with purpose. Every area in the game feels like it fits into Rapture perfectly by expanding on something that was already incredible with the whole eerie vibe of this underwater city that essentially feels like a lost relic now more than ever with the flooded areas. Everything is dark with a grim undertone, and again, we find out more and more about the world through the usage of audio logs which expand upon the lore set in Bioshock 1. It's not bad, but it doesn't really compare as there's no more things like the hallucinations from Plasmids, and splicers themselves don't necessarily feel as creepy as they did in the first Bioshock. It's a drastically different shift, and one that makes the game feel a little more actiony over anything else. Either way, Rapture as a setting is still phenomenal and one of the best in gaming. Music in Bioshock 2 is also pretty good as well. I would say it differs a bit from the first game in that there's a lot more somber and depressing sounding tracks, like the How She Sees the World track, but there are a few that still fit the bill of having a very creepy tone. The Abyss and Persephone are pretty haunting sounding, and both have a bit of a chilling vibe to them. Same goes for Drained Memories. There's something bleak about this track that makes it feel desolate. I think I enjoy bits of the soundtrack of Bioshock 2 a bit more than the first, though I think that the overall soundtrack pretty much fits the same vibes as the first game at least. Continuing on, we also have the voice acting of the game. Once again, it's superb. We get to hear the return of some characters from the first game via audio logs, but then there's also the addition of new characters who also have top-notch voice acting performances. I especially love Sinclair. Like, why not have a man who sounds like him in the game? It's absolutely perfect and actually fits and makes sense within the context of someone living in Rapture. I'll also say that Lamb does a good job too, though I wish there was more build-up for her character. She's a very intellectual person, as we could tell with the audio logs, but as the overall mastermind, I feel there could have been more to her. Other than that, I'll also give Gil Alexander props too. What we see as an initially bonkers character ends up being a very sad end. It's another moment where you get to feel a little sympathetic as a player with morality on the line. But anyways, overall, the voice acting of Bioshock 2 is just as great as the first game. As for any issues I found with Bioshock 2, well, it's mainly the head bobbing. In the same vein as Bioshock 1, the head bob in Bioshock 2 is quite sickening. Like I said in my last video, I'm easily susceptible to motion sickness these days, and I found myself getting the same migraine-inducing feeling from the head bob in Bioshock 2, in no small part thanks to the gross crouch walking. Anytime I had to use this, I felt an awful strain on my eyes that I never want to experience ever again. Other than this, I'll also add that Bioshock 2 has a lot of crashing issues on PC. I honestly didn't run into any problems playing the first game, but oh boy, with Bioshock 2 I experienced more than I'm comfortable with. The worst part is that this is something that'll probably never get fixed too, which is a shame because the game is actually pretty good. It's fun to play, but when you see more than a handful of crashes, it really ruins the mood. There was a mod that I downloaded that was supposed to fix the crashing issues, but I still got another crash after the fact. Ultimately, I ended up having to spam the quick save button out of paranoia and found myself taking breaks every few hours just because it felt like the game would eventually hit a point where it decided it didn't want to work anymore. Just sucks that I had to come to this kind of thing. But anyways, that's it for the base game. Before we close out, we have one last thing to go over. Minerva's Den. Yep, I didn't forget this. So once again, spoilers, because we're gonna cover the story DLC of Bioshock 2 real quick. Minerva's Den begins with Big Daddy subject Sigma traveling to the Minerva's Den. From here, we hear the voice of someone named Reed Wall, who calls for explosives to be detonated in the tunnel leading up to the location. Sigma's blasted, then blacks out, where we see that some time has passed. Sigma then awakens, finding himself underwater when he's contacted by Charles Milton Porter. At this point, we're told that Sigma is to help Tenenbaum and Porter get something called the Thinker out of Rapture. Sigma then heads into Minerva's den, where he's told by Porter that the place was cut off from Rapture and was without power, which leads Sigma to have to restore it. Shortly after, Sigma's contacted by Reed Wall, who tells Sigma that the Thinker machine had chosen him. Heading in further, Sigma's told by Porter that he and Reed founded Rapture Central Computing together, but he had been pushed out. This essentially means that everything in the area is under Reed's control. So anyways, Sigma goes on, restoring the power to the den. From here, he's told to head to Porter's office. Along the way, Sigma's told by Porter that the goal is to make a hard copy of the Thinker and then head back to the surface. Upon getting to Porter's office, Sigma's given top-level access to enter the area. At this moment, Sigma's told by Porter to grab an Ops access punch card and then head to Ops to get the core access. Sadly, unable to continue due to the door being locked by maglocks, Sigma's then sent to find a plasmid called Gravity Well to open the way. From here, Sigma heads to an archives warehouse to find the plasmid and then heads back to unlock the door and heads straight down an elevator. Upon entering the next area, Rapture Central Computing, Reed contacts Sigma saying that Porter is a convenient excuse to disrupt his work, which has him curious, but not curious enough to let him live. This leads Sigma to have to fight, after which he's contacted by Porter. Porter tells him that he has a bathysphere at his lab that should be able to get them out of Rapture. But first, they need to reprogram a signal beacon. The reason for that being Lamb had the city on lockdown, and if they didn't reprogram a beacon, they would be blown up by a torpedo. This leads Sigma to have to search for a beacon in the seafloor outside of Minerva's den. He finds a beacon on the downed bathysphere and then heads to put it in a master input console in the programming wing, which is located behind a secret bookshelf entrance in Reed's office. Anyways, Sigma's able to get the signal beacon hacked and then heads to core access. But before he could actually do so, Sigma's stopped by Reed, who puts the Thinker's cooling system into overdrive, causing him to be frozen out of the area. This leads Sigma to have to head to climate control to reset the turbine to defrost the ice. But first, Sigma grabs an incinerate plasmid. After this, he heads to climate control, melting the frozen controls and then using the switch, allowing him to progress to the Thinker's computer core. After successfully reaching the mainframe area, Sigma eventually runs across Reed Wall. Sigma chases Reed, who continuously contacts Sigma, questioning why he's even going to the core. Reed also mentions that there was a point where Andrew Ryan's police had come for Porter, causing him to disappear for a long time. This is supposed to be the point where things start to come full circle when Sigma comes across an audio log from Porter, who says that people who disappear come back as Big Daddies. Anyways, Sigma continues on to the Thinker's core, heading to a control booth to start a code printer to start the process to make a copy of the Thinker. This causes Reed to come out of nowhere and basically yell at Sigma while he shuts the Thinker down. This is followed by Tenenbaum contacting Sigma, saying that with the Thinker shut down, Minerva's den will fall to the pieces, leading Sigma to have to take down Reed and then restore power to the Thinker. Anyways, Sigma takes out everything in the room, Reed Wall included, taking the administrator punch card from its corpse and then going on to reactivate the Thinker. Thinker then goes on to confirm what we had been suspecting with the last audio log, that subject Sigma was in fact Charles Milton Porter. Tenenbaum goes on to say that she wanted Sigma to get a copy of the Thinker's programming to restore him back to the person that he was before. Sigma then heads on, finding another office of his where he discovers a bunch of stuff involving the death of his wife, Pearl. Sigma then heads to a bathysphere with Tenenbaum inside, launching the device where we see a cutscene of Porter saying he lived through the Blitz and the fall of Rapture, where he lost his memory, his voice, and everything that made him a man. From here, we see closure with Porter near a gravestone for his wife, and that is the end of Minerva's Den. Summing up the DLC, I'd say that the story of Minerva's Den is actually more interesting than the base game of Bioshock 2. The whole time playing, you just kind of felt like there was a twist waiting to happen. And the sad ending involving Porter is also something that I honestly didn't expect to see either. I also think that Wall as a villain was kind of somewhat underwhelming. I will at least give credit that Wall felt like he was kind of a non-stop annoying, which helped in making the player dislike him enough to want to get rid of him. Either way, I still found Minerva's Den to be quite good and definitely had just as much fun playing it as the base game. The gameplay in the Minerva's Den section of Bioshock 2 is pretty much the same as the base game, but it definitely felt like the new areas were a lot more expansive. You could honestly run around doing just this story and not really see a lot of the extra sites or obtain extra plasmids. It's sort of like a boatload of optional stuff on the side that acts as time padding. Overall though, it's more of the same, but really I think that Minerva's Den does a great job at promoting exploration. There's also one major difference in that there's no research camera in Minerva's Den, which kind of makes it so that some weapons don't feel nearly as strong as in the base game. That being said, there is a new weapon and a new plasmid attack in Minerva's Den. The new weapon, the ion laser, is basically a beam that shoots, well, lasers. It's pretty dang powerful too. There's nothing quite as satisfying as hitting enemies with the laser and just shredding health doing so. Then there's a gravity well plasmid. This thing is pretty beast when it's maxed level 3 and does acid damage on top of pulling in everything in its proximity. It's quite fun to use too, and honestly, it was probably my favorite plasma to use outside of Winter Freeze. New enemies of the DLC include the Fiery Brute Splicer, the Wintry Houdini Splicer, and the Lancer Big Daddy. The Fiery Brute Splicer is pretty much a Brute Splicer on extra steroids. These things are immune to fire, but that's not really much of an issue. They're not super bad to take on if you just tag them with plasmids and just blast them with the laser. The Wintry Houdini Splicer is again just a Houdini Splicer, but now immune to Winter Blast. They can freeze themselves, which makes them sort of blend in with other frozen splicers in the coldish areas. They're not so bad either, but the Houdini teleporting is always annoying. Lastly, there's the Lancer Big Daddy. These things are super aggressive Big Daddies equipped with a laser. These dudes love to rush and are honestly kind of tense fights. I think they're a good addition to the game since the battles feel a lot more chaotic than they did in the base game with the Big Daddy types there. That's really it for the new enemies here. Moving on to other things, the voice acting in Minerva's Den was also just as good as the base game. We see a return of Tenenbaum, who once again has a solid performance too. But then there's also Charles Milton Porter, who is pretty much guiding you almost the entirety of the DLC. His voice acting is also top notch and I'd say pretty likable. Same goes for Reed Wall, who I find does a perfectly sleazy character. It's good stuff, and once again really highlights everything to make the game world actually feel more immersive and believable. And that's everything with Bioshock 2. It's a pretty fun game to play, but I think the narrative aspect is a little underwhelming. It's not bad, but it feels a little forgettable in some ways. I have played Bioshock 2 in the past, and I honestly could tell you that there was a lot of people in the game who I didn't remember at all. Like this dude, Stanley Poole. He plays such a big role in setting off some of the events of the game, yet he feels so unimportant for some reason because he is in such a short section. Lamb is the only character that I did remember, and that's even with her being a strangely weak villain despite being an insanely manipulative leader. Either way, even though I don't find the narrative to be the best thing ever, the base game and even the Minerva's Den DLC are still pretty fun to play, and I guess I do at least appreciate the expanded lore of Rapture. I'd also say that the improvements towards things like the combat make Bioshock 2 a far better and way more enjoyable experience. I think not being able to backtrack and revisit old areas kind of sucks though, but what can you do? I don't think I minded replaying the game so much, but the crashing issues happening on PC makes it feel way harder to want to go through again. I don't like having to save every half hour because a game's broken. I don't know what 2K did with this PC version of the game, but this is a pretty pathetic way to treat one of their best IPs. But at the end of the day, Bioshock 2 is still a pretty good game. I just wish it was treated better on PC by 2K. Thank you all for watching. If you made it to the end, why not give a like and also subscribe too if you already haven't. We'll be back again with more soon, so stay tuned. Until next time, peace out.